Supports. I'm Carol Emig, President of Child Trends and the moderator for today's webinar. Joining me are Kristen Anderson-Moore, Senior Scholar and Co-Director of the Youth Development Area at Child Trends, Dan Cardinale, President of Communities and Schools, Mary Walsh, Executive Director of City Connects and the Daniel Kearns Professor in the Lynch School of Education at Boston College, and Jane Quinn, Vice President for Community Schools at the Children's Aid Society and Director of the National Center for Community Schools. Here you see our agenda for this briefing. I'm going to kick us off with 2 minutes on Child Trends and why we undertook this work, then turn the program over to Chris Moore, who will review our research. As we go through the presentations, we encourage you to write down questions and send them to us so that we can address as many of them as possible during the question and answer period. A word now about Child Trends. We are a nonpartisan research center focused exclusively on children and youth. In everything we do, we are child-centered, field rigorous, and impartial. Much of our research focuses on building the field of child and youth serving programs and policies, and we do this in several ways. We work with individual programs to strengthen their approach and to evaluate their effectiveness. We design new programs and recommend changes or refinements to existing programs and policies. We take a critical lens to promising approaches like ISS to see how they align with what we know about child and youth development, whether an evidence base exists, and if so, how strong is that base and how can we make it stronger? And of course, we share our knowledge with the larger field. Turning now to the Child Trends study, the concept of integrated student supports will be familiar to many of you, even if the term is not. It is a wraparound approach to providing at-risk students with an array of academic and non-academic supports. Chris will say more about the definition of integrated student supports in just a minute. I'm delighted that we have 3 of the leading providers of integrated student supports with us on this webinar, and each of them will offer comments and reflections on the research and on their work when Chris finishes. Here at Child Trends, we had several reasons for wanting to examine the research and evidence base for integrated student supports. First, like most Americans, we're troubled by the education achievement gap between poor and affluent children and between children of color and white children. As researchers, we're also troubled by the small number of proven interventions to help close this gap. So we always want to look closely at promising programs and approaches. Second, programs using an integrated student supports approach are popping up all over the country, especially in schools serving some of our poorest and most at-risk students. We estimate that ISS programs of one sort or another operate in about 3,000 schools across the country, serving primarily low-income Black and Hispanic students. Given this proliferation, it's important to ask whether this approach is a good use of scarce resources and of students' time. Is it a strategy for closing the achievement gap? And finally, we were intrigued by what appeared to us to be the alignment between the ISS approach and the basic research on child and youth development. Chris will say more about this in her presentation, but I just want to note that we at Child Trends wanted to look further into what appeared to us to be a whole child approach to improving educational outcomes. Now, with that context in mind, and with support from Bloomberg Philanthropies and the AT&T Foundation, we undertook the study that we're presenting today. To lead the study, we turned to one of the top scholars in the child and youth field, Child Trends' own senior scholar, Kristen Anderson-Moore. She and her research team examined the research and the evaluations underlying ISS. They interviewed the leading providers in the field, and they undertook additional quantitative analyses. I believe on our website you can find both a brief summary, white paper summary of the research, and also the full 150-page single-spaced report. I'll turn the briefing over now to Chris.
Thank you, Carol, and thanks to everyone for joining. First, to begin at the beginning, what are integrated student supports, or ISS, as we will say for short? ISS is an emerging field of practice which relies on the coordination of prevention and intervention services for students and families in order to remove academic and non-academic barriers to learning, to increase chances of school success, and also expand opportunities for positive youth development. To lessen the suspense, I'll begin by sharing our key findings. First, there is emerging evidence that ISS models can contribute to student academic progress. Preliminary studies find a positive return on investment. Importantly, ISS as a student-centered approach is firmly grounded in child and youth development research. And ISS is aligned with empirical research on the varied factors that promote educational success. But high-quality implementation is important to achieve outcomes. This review of ISS involved a number of elements. First, this examination of ISS models in practice on the ground, a synthesis of educational research published in journals and in reports, new empirical analyses using the National Educational Longitudinal Survey, an assessment of the alignment with child development theory, a review of rigorous outcome evaluations, an examination of 3 cost-benefit analyses, and an assessment of implementation evaluations. I will briefly describe each of these as they all contributed to our conclusions. First, an examination of ISS models in practice. 9 ISS approaches shown here were reviewed. These are national models that operate in multiple states and school districts, serving an estimated 1.5 million at-risk students, of whom 75% of the students are Black or Hispanic. There are both similarities and differences across the models. The similarities include having common core components. Also, they target needs and then offer supports for students, schools, and families. And the supports are tailored to the needs of the community, school, and/or student. The differences are also important in that models implement the core components in different ways. The 5 core components are shown here in this ring. They include student needs assessments first. These assessments ask questions like, do students have health needs, behavior problems, family problems? What are the needs of students in the school? The second core component is to develop and provide coordinated student supports based on the needs assessment. Third, to form community partnerships to address needs. Coordinated supports are often provided in the school, but they are also provided by community agencies and partnerships needed to be developed to do this. The next, 4th core component is integration within schools across ISS staff, teachers, principals, counselors, and others in the school. And 5th, the use of data to track outcomes. I was pleasantly surprised as a researcher to find that data comprised 2 of the 5 core components. This aligns with a wide recognition of the importance of being data-driven and evidence-based. Well, this next slide shows examples of common supports for students at the student level, at the family level, and at the school level. For example, student-level supports might include physical health or mental health interventions, or in-school academic or expanded learning time opportunities. So ISS programs don't focus just on academic or non-academic needs. They focus on both. At the family level, supports might include social services for families in need, or parent education or counseling. And at the school level, it might include efforts to improve the school climate or to improve school effectiveness. You'll see this reflected in the ISS theory of change shown on this slide, and I'm going to go from right to left. To reach the long-term outcomes shown on the right, which are high school graduation and post-secondary degree or certification, you need to obtain good non-academic outcomes and academic outcomes shown as short-term outcomes. In order to achieve those outcomes, you need supports, such as physical and mental health, in-school and expanded learning time, school climate, the kinds of supports we just talked about. These reflect and depend on the 5 core components: the needs assessment, community partnerships, coordinated student supports, integration within the school, and data tracking. And varied influential factors are recognized, not just the student, but the family, the school, and the community. Turning to the next topic, ISS is aligned with child and youth development theory. It is a child-centered approach. It's not school-centered. It takes a life course perspective. In other words, it recognizes that what happens early in a child's life affects what happens later on to that child. It takes a positive youth development approach, focusing on positive relationships, experiences, and goals. It's based on a whole child perspective. That is, that health, emotional development, and behavior are all important, not just academic outcomes, and that the health, emotional development, and behavior are important to academic outcomes. And it's based on ecological theory. It sees the child's context as critical influences. The next slide illustrates the context that influence development. Of course, the child is at the center and is influenced by parent and family, by peers, by the school, by the neighborhood, and by state and federal policies. The ecological model shown here also informed our research review and our original analyses as well. We examined what factors lead to educational success for each of these domains in the ecological model. Based on our review of educational research and our own original analyses, it is clear that many factors influence school success. There is no one single button to push. And it's clear that the factors span domains. They're not just in-school factors. The three largest effects in our original analyses were the child's math score in 8th grade, talking to a parent about school, and an adolescent birth. All of these factors affected whether or not the student finished high school. And as you can see, they're from very different domains. Individually, other than these, we found that most of the factors have relatively small effects. Collectively, across domains, they matter. And this provides empirical evidence for the comprehensiveness of the ISS approach. Next, we conducted a review of evaluations to address the question, do ISS models improve academic and non-academic outcomes? And to assess this, we identified evaluations, we examined the rigor of each evaluation, and we summarized program effects on academic and also on non-academic outcomes, because both are important in the ISS theory of change. We found nearly a dozen rigorous evaluations. Out of the 36 outcome evaluations we reviewed, 11 met our criteria and 25 did not. Of the 11 evaluations included in our review, 4 were RCTs, that's a randomized clinical control trial, and 7 were quasi-experimental designs, or QEDs. 8 of the evaluations evaluated the full ISS model. Of these, 1 was a random assignment and 7 were quasi-experimental. And 3 evaluated partial ISS models. These 3 evaluations are the communities and schools random assignment evaluations. They compared students in level 2, the intensive level, with students in randomly assigned to be in level 2, with students in level 1, to see if the intensive services made a difference over and above the basic services. So there is currently only one RCT that compares ISS schools with non-ISS schools. Well, findings for academic outcomes are promising. We see some improvements in student school progress, attendance, math, and reading and English language, and overall grade point average. However, most effects are found in quasi-experimental studies. Also, non-academic outcomes have few evaluations and few results. For example, regarding effects on student school progress, look, if you will, across the orange row. Those are measures of the outcomes for student progress. You'll see down the side the different things that fall under that general category, the cumulative promotion index, which is grade promotion across 3 years, credit completion, retention and grade, dropout, and promoting power, being promoted to the next grade on time. Then if you will look over on the far right, this is the quasi-experimental column, and you'll see that overall 3 out of 4 evaluations found at least one significant effect in this school progress area. However, in the middle column, the RCTs, or randomized controlled trials, 0 out of 2 produced at least one significant impact. We see that across fields, by the way, where it's much harder to get a significant impact, a statistically significant impact when there is an RCT than when there is a QED. Now, looking at effects on school attendance, a similar pattern is evident. The quasi-experimental evaluations, we find 3 out of 3 studies with at least one significant effect on a measure of school attendance, and these measures include absenteeism, chronic absenteeism, and the attendance rate. In the random assignment studies, 1 out of 4 studies produces at least one significant impact. Turning to effects on academic achievement, for reading, math, and grade point average, we again see a number of positive effects for the quasi-experimental design evaluations, 4 out of 6, and 1 for math scores. We include reading, math, and overall achievement here. And in the RCT column, there are 0 out of 3 for reading, 1 out of 4 for math, and 0 out of 4 for overall achievement. Thus, we characterize the findings as promising, if not definitive, because there is support in the quasi-experimental studies and some mixed support in the random assignment studies. However, there is less evidence for the effects on student-level non-academic outcomes. Far fewer of them are studied. In this chart, we show school attachment, school behavior problems, social and emotional learning, and health and safety. There are mixed findings for the quasi-experimental studies, but null findings so far for the randomized clinical trials. We also did a review of cost effectiveness, or return on investment. 3 studies estimated long-term payback for $1 invested. As you can see, the estimates are very positive, ranging from $4 to $15 per $1 invested. These estimates of return on investment, however, use different and quite complex assumptions and methods. One particularly critical assumption is that services and programs provided by the ISS models are included as a cost, and these programs do provide a number of supports. But services provided in the community are not considered a cost. An example of this might be if a program were using AmeriCorps volunteers. There are obviously some costs to the program for using AmeriCorps volunteers, but there are also costs outside of the program to creating the program and getting volunteers for the program, and those costs would not be included. This is aligned with the ISS theory of change, but there are unexamined questions, and one is whether communities really have unused capacity that needs to be accessed, and whether there really are no incremental community costs or opportunity costs with providing these community services. On the other hand, the question might be raised whether the ISS model provides efficiencies which lower costs. Nevertheless, despite these outstanding questions, it appears that the return on investment is safely over $1. Well, turning next to our review of implementation evaluations. We identified studies that examined associations between implementation approaches and outcomes. These are, of course, all non-experimental studies because they're looking at participants in programs. We selected studies that met the outcome evaluation review criteria and then summarized the effects on academic outcomes. One clear finding stands out, which is that ISS implementation quality is related to school-level outcomes. 2 models explored associations between implementation and academic outcomes. One is the Communities in Schools National Evaluation, and this drew on data from elementary, middle, and high schools across 3 years. And it used an implementation rubric with 19 items that had a number of characteristics to it. For example, whether a needs assessment was done and how frequently it was done, whether an annual operations plan is done, and how often student progress is reviewed. And students were categorized as either low or high. And the Comer schools have completed 2 studies in Chicago and in Maryland, and their index has 11 items, and it's much more subjective. It's somewhat different. How effective is the team that deals with behavioral issues? The extent to which the entire school community participated in decisions, and the extent to which they are really committed. And a continuous score was developed on the basis of those kinds of items. Well, the specific results are mixed. I think it's fair to say that they're kind of all over the map and they don't tell the story as yet. However, it is clear from both studies that quality matters. But it isn't clear which activities or processes or combinations of activities or processes are related to better outcomes. As I said, both found positive associations with quality as they measured it. This matters because we need to know the ingredients that make for an effective program. And right now that's not clear. So more research is needed to identify the core components of ISS, whether they are activities or processes or both. Well, one particularly interesting finding regarding implementation quality is from the Communities in Schools study, which found that low quality implementation is no different than no program at all. And this comports with early childhood and youth development findings on the importance of quality in a program to achieving good outcomes. So we can conclude, although it is only one study, but we feel we can conclude that high quality implementation is key. But we have to emphasize that it is not yet clear which services affect what outcomes and which students are most likely to benefit. In sum, across ISS models, the details differ, but the overarching approaches, or the elements or core components, are quite similar. Comprehensive services are offered. It's not just academic. Supports are integrated, not just co-located. And ISS is person-based and student-focused as much as it is place-based. Needs assessments are conducted and they are taken seriously. Ongoing data and monitoring are emphasized. It's not just an initial assessment, but ongoing data collection and use of data that are collected. And also, families and communities are engaged. 6 key conclusions. First, as an approach, ISS is based in research on child and youth development, and it draws profoundly from the wisdom of experienced practitioners. This is a primary reason for seeing ISS as a promising approach. However, the evidence base regarding effectiveness is emerging. Findings are promising, especially for academic outcomes, but the evidence comes primarily from quasi-experimental evaluations. Also, our understanding of ISS core components is general, not specific. Fourth, research, both our own review of research and our own original analyses, indicates the determinants of educational achievement and attainment are myriad and include non-academic factors. Individualized or tiered attention to these non-academic needs, as done in ISS models, can improve academic performance. And 6, initial estimates of cost effectiveness indicate that the return on investment is greater than $1 per dollar invested. We worked hard to complete a strong review that can inform practice and policy, but we found a number of research gaps. So I want to end with a quick list of research needs. Because ISS is a promising and rapidly growing approach with emerging evidence, further research and evaluation seem warranted, including more impact evaluations. We need to assess both academic and non-academic outcomes, the mediators as well as the outcomes. And I should note that several are in the works. One is an I3, so we will see an increase in our knowledge base shortly. We also need research on best practices to identify what components are essential and what works for whom, for example, for different age groups. We need greater uniformity across evaluations in terms of measures, methods, and rigor, so we can build a stronger knowledge base. And we need richer data in national surveys on educational contexts and practices to inform practice, and we need more work to estimate costs and cost effectiveness. So thank you. Now we are fortunate to be able to hear from 3 educational leaders. First, we will hear from Dan Cardinale of Communities and Schools.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to the folks at Child Trends for really this remarkable piece of work. It's really, I think, a watershed moment for those of us who've been doing this work for many years. And I also just want to thank my colleagues, Dr. Mary Walsh and Jane Quinn. It's an honor to be on the call with you all. I would like to say one thing before we go through kind of a brief overview of what CIS is doing vis-a-vis the building of an evidence base and how we think about using it. And that is, I think there's a discipline that I would like to charge all of us with thinking about as we read this report and begin to move out into our various work, be us policymakers or practitioners or innovators, that it's clear what the report is. And it's a foundational document on which we can stand regarding an emerging evidence base that will give us some directionality, important directionality about where we want to go, what we want to continue to learn, what we can lean into as effective practice, and a fairly substantial amount of area of where we want to continue to experiment and grow and learn. I think what the report is not is a comprehensive, definitive analysis of all of the work in the sector, whether it be integrated student services or wraparound services or community schools. There's a lot of very important information also in the field, and I think it's this report is an important contribution, and one would think a foundational contribution, but certainly not exhaustive of what I think is out there. And we want to be balanced in not overstepping or understepping what this report can do. So that being said, let's go to the next slide. Just a brief overview for folks who are not familiar with Communities and Schools. We're founded in 1977. We're a network of about 200 nonprofits. We're in about half of the country. We work with about 1.3 million students in 2,200 public schools and about 375 school districts. We take very seriously engagement of parents and families, so 250,000 parents and guardians. And as was mentioned at the beginning, we share this value of really working with the most at-risk students in schools. So 97% of our students are on free and reduced price lunch. Over 80% are students of color. Next slide. At the heart of CIS is a classic integration model. And so this is on our website. I want to point out just a couple of essential elements that very much are echoed in the research. The first is on that upper left-hand corner, number 1. You see a woman in a tank top with a CIS logo next to her. We have about 4,500 staff across the United States, and the vast majority are in schools. They are mostly licensed social workers and masters in social work, but above and beyond that, we as a network have a certification process that ensures that they are not only good, well-trained mental health and community organizing professionals, but they in fact are trained in the integrated student service model per se. The second piece I think that's important to point out is in number 2, where you heard Chris talk a lot about integration. And we see integration in 2 very important ways. One is that the integrated student support strategy is an integral part of the overall architecture of the school. So you see the site coordinator there really seconded to the principal and teachers to develop a comprehensive integrated student support strategy that aligns directly and seamlessly with the overall designs of driving academic excellence for all students. And then the second way you see integration here is in that student in the center, where you see the resources coming in. And you heard Chris talk about a student-centric or a tailored approach. So the integration is the notion that each student, whether in a prevention model at the whole school level or a targeted and sustained intervention at the individual student level, has a tailored approach, so that the right sets of services are going to the right students in the right dosage. And we see this based on our own work and our own evaluation as critically important. So the notion of integration taking place at the school level, ideally ultimately at the school system level, and at the actual student level is how we think about integration. Next slide. So we, among the other models that were reviewed, are very committed to not only having an evidence base, but being a virtuous learning organization. So we look to research and evaluation as an ongoing process that helps us deepen our understanding of the work and become more effective. Chris mentioned a number of the studies that have contributed to this. We did a study, a 5-year longitudinal evaluation with ICF International, funded by Atlantic Philanthropies. It concluded in 2010. You can see here that it showed positive effects on dropout and graduation. And she called out this fidelity study, which turned out to be one of the more significant learnings for us, that really rigor of implementation of what we know to be effective practice from the evaluation really does matter. And we have leaned heavily into that, and I will talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Secondly, we are also very committed to continuous learning, and so through the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation and the Wallace Foundation, we have another set of studies going on. One is this random control trial, which will be one of the largest of the integrated student service model done, 28 middle schools and high schools with 2,200 students. And we also have this comparative interrupted time series, which we wanted to get at a number of the research questions that Chris outlined, the notions of intensity and dosage and effects on behavior and attitude, some of the non-academic outcomes that are so critical, and a continuous deep dive into this cost analysis, which we think is critically important to really understand. And then we're delighted to be of a whole school reform strategy, which has an integrated student service strategy CIS model built right into it called Diplomas Now. And we were part of a winning I3 grant, and we're in the process now of having really the largest random control trial ever of a whole school reform with 60 schools involved. And that will be out in a couple of years. So we hope to contribute significantly to our own learning and to the learning of the field. And then finally, the next slide, I just wanted to highlight something that I think is important for us as a field. We take this very seriously, and we offer up this framework as a way of thinking about being a virtuous community of learners. That this evaluation work, and this Child Trends Report being a great example, produces insights. And to glean as much of those insights as possible, bring those in dialogue with practitioners, and develop a framework for really driving quality implementation at a significant scale. Collectively, we're working with 1.5 million students, all of the integrated student service providers, and that's a huge responsibility. So just what CIS has done is after our ICF evaluation, we had a large implementation study, and we were able to, with our network, develop 2 fundamental standards. One on the right there, this notion of really building local affiliates, our CIS local affiliates, who are really the leaders in the communities around this work, needed to be strong, sustainable organizations that could partner systemically with school systems in which they're operating, and partner with superintendents and school boards to really be a resource in driving the vision of improving academic outcomes for young people. So having an institution that was dedicated to this work and could train and manage at the school site level was critically important. And then, of course, on the left-hand side, we have a set of school-based standards of really driving the process I showed you early and using data to continually refine that. We see the combination, actually, of a management framework that ensures for and promotes high-quality implementation, and then deep attention to ongoing implementation as the secret combination of really driving at a high scale this notion of greater impacts for children. So I look forward to the conversation with everybody, and I'll turn it over to one of my esteemed colleagues, Dr. Mary Walsh.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. Let me begin by acknowledging that schools have always recognized the importance of the out-of-school needs of students. Classroom teachers in this country know this intuitively, and whole professions, for example, school counseling, social work, school psychology, health education, nursing, and others, have been developed to deliver student support in schools. However, the challenge has been the practice associated with the work of student support in schools. It often varies from school to school and district to district. In large part, it has not been data-driven and has not been able to make sufficient use of the rich resources in the community. Further, the practice of student support has not been systematic or evidence-based. As a result, in 1998, in collaboration with the Boston Public Schools, the local community agencies, families, and our philanthropic partners, we designed and implemented City Connect and are now in 6 districts across 3 states. City Connect systematizes the delivery of student support in the schools, and it leverages community and district resources to supply critical services and enrichments. Its practices assesses the holistic strengths and needs of each and every student in collaboration with each classroom teacher, and it does this across 4 domains of child development: academic, social emotional, health, and family. It then links students one by one to a tailored set of services and enrichments in the community and the school district. It electronically tracks the service delivery and follows up on each child. And it does this with a full-time, licensed and trained either school counselor or school social worker who's based in the school full-time. City Connects has engaged in rigorous evaluation. 5 of the 11 studies that Chris cited, examined in the Child Trends report, were carried out on City Connects. So what are the results? After a short time in the intervention, we see a positive impact on academic achievement and thriving. Even more significantly, long after students have left a City Connect school, the intervention has a positive effect on outcomes such as chronic absenteeism, retention and grade, and amazingly, many years later, on school dropout. It leads to nearly half the dropout rate typical in the district. So why is the Child Trends report so important? Because it pulls together in some of the very different interventions that address the out-of-school needs of students. And also because it makes a very significant statement about how this work is a critical lever in closing the achievement gap. It highlights the foundational role of child development research, although one wishes it had focused a bit more on children's strengths and resilience. But the bottom line is that this report points to the importance of comprehensive student support as a critical strategy to improving children's achievement and their well-being. Next slide, please. Aligned with that conclusion is the report's explicit assumption that quality matters. City Connects obsesses about quality. Why? Because all of these interventions propose to do something very bold. That is, to intervene in the life course of children and adolescents. This means that we have a profound responsibility to do it with the highest quality practice and the highest quality research that we can muster. From our perspective, rigorous practice is standardized across schools, but flexible at the level of the child so that it is tailored to each and every child. Rigorous practice also means that we can measure fidelity of implementation across the schools. And for those interventions that work inside schools, it must rely on licensed credentialed professionals. Finally, rigorous practice requires us to answer the question, should the intervention leave the school, what is left behind? Are there sustainable changes in current structures? Are there changes in how both schools and community partners do business? In short, are the schools transformed? Rigorous research means relying on multiple methods, both qualitative and quantitative, cross-sectional and longitudinal, and it utilizes different types of analysis because each type of analysis has both strengths and weaknesses depending on the situation. High-quality randomized trials with sufficient numbers have a high level of internal validity. Quasi-experimental designs, however, may produce more generalizable results because they are closer to real-world conditions. That is, they have more external validity. Rigorous research also measures effects on students, of course, but critically on teachers, community agency staff, and families. The next slide, please. And going forward, one of the critical tasks for research is examining the impact on outcomes of the substantial differences across these interventions. For example, the degree to which these programs are integrated into existing student support structures in schools and into the work of existing student support staff and teachers. The 9 programs in this report vary widely on this dimension, and it is easy to imagine that these differences might impact outcomes. Another critical area for research, which City Connects has underway, is identifying how the interventions work. That is, the mechanisms through which the intervention produces the effects that it does. In conclusion, high-quality, evidence-based student support will lead to equalized educational opportunity for children who face social and economic disadvantage. Thank you. And now we'll hear from Jane Quinn of the Children's Aid Society.
Jane, you might just check your phone to make sure you're not on mute. So this is Frank Walter with Child Trends. We're just waiting to see if we can restore Jane's line. She's calling in from Cleveland, but I want to take this minute just to remind everyone that if you have some questions that you would like to ask one of the speakers, please send those in. We have some questions already, and when we finish with Jane, we'll start the Q&A, but please feel free to send your questions now.
Frank, this is Carol. While we're waiting for Jane, shall I go ahead and start to put some questions to our panelists?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, I'm going to kick us off by noting that we've had some communication and correspondence with Howard Edelman and Linda Taylor of the School Mental Health Project at UCLA. And I think that both Mary and Dan did actually respond to some of the issues that Howard and Linda have raised, but let me just read from one of the emails that they sent us and see if there's anything that either Dan or Mary would like to add to this. Their concern is that readers not get the impression, or listeners to this webinar not get the impression that the idea of integrated student supports is only about linking and co-locating whatever community resources are available. Howard and Linda point out that in their mind this would continue, or in their thinking this would continue, a trend to marginalize and ignore the many student and learning supports that schools themselves operate and which need to be woven together with a wide range of community resources and reworked into a unified and comprehensive system. They note that they have consistently concluded that such a system is essential to addressing barriers to learning and teaching and to re-engaging disconnected students. In this way, it is essential to enhancing equity of opportunity for all students to succeed at school and beyond. I thought, Mary and Dan, I thought both of you did touch on this perspective and refer to it in your presentations, but I just ask you both whether you have anything additional you'd like to add.
Ladies first.
Mary, go ahead, Dan. Yeah.
This is Mary Walsh. I would totally concur with Howard Edelman and Linda Taylor. We actually designed City Connects using their conceptual framework, and a systemic approach to this work is critical, and there is no question that working from inside a school out has always been the perspective that we've taken. It's not the only one, but I completely agree with their position and have for years.
Thanks, Mary. Dan?
So I would, first of all, I hold Linda Taylor and Howard Edelman's work in extraordinarily high regard, and it has continuously informed our thinking at communities and schools. So first of all, thank you to both of them. I would agree very much with this notion of a systemic approach. It is something that's near and dear to our heart. We've worked on a number of dimensions, both at the, to Mary's point about the school moving out. I would like to note that I think that there's an incredibly important role for community to play in schools. We mobilize about 50 to 70,000 volunteers, and we partner with upwards of 15,000 community agencies on an annual basis. And our experience tells us that the arrows go in both directions. But what I've gleaned from Linda and Howard's work is that in some ways there are trained professionals in the building or at the school level who really have an expertise about how to fully take advantage of that. It's our business at communities and schools to ensure we are in deep dialogue with those folks as we engage the community and align the resources under a kind of architecture that they lead. So it's really leveraging a set of resources that often go untapped that I think is what is so critical. And so that's where we see the arrows going in both directions.
So let's thank you, Dan. Let's pause for a minute to see if Jane has rejoined the call.
Well, let's find out. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, so I missed part of that discussion, which sounded really interesting, but I guess you want me to give my response to the report, right?
Why don't you go right ahead? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So like my colleagues Dan and Mary, I'll give a little bit of background on the work that we're doing in New York City and nationally, and then I will give a few thoughts about the report, which I learned a lot from already on a couple of readings, and will continue to mine it, I'm sure. The Children's Aid Society is New York City's oldest and largest youth organization. We had our 160th birthday this year, and our budget this year is at $130 million. So we are a large, comprehensive service organization that works all over New York City. 22 years ago, we opened our first community school in New York City in partnership with what was then the New York City Board of Education, now the Department of Education. So we are a lead agency partner in 16 schools in New York City, in 4 of the city's lowest income neighborhoods. And since 1994, we have also sponsored the National Center for Community Schools, which is a part of our organization that actually provides implementation assistance to community school leaders across the country and quite unintentionally across the world. We've had visitors from 74 countries come to see our community schools in New York City in action. So next slide, please. Great, thank you. I'd like to talk first, I'll kind of reiterate, I think, what Dan and Mary said. This is a report, really a landmark study. It has many, many strengths. I particularly appreciated the research-based assessment of what young people need in order to achieve productive adulthood. I think that often we forget how complex this process is, and I think this report is really a wonderful reminder and really gives us the science underneath what we know about that process. Secondly, I really appreciated the strong analysis of the common essential practices or ingredients. I think they're called components in the report. I think of these 5 ingredients as practices, and although I'm well aware of the variations in how they are implemented in many of the models that were studied, I do think that this is a very useful analysis for us as we think across the models and then think about the commonalities. I also appreciated, as a practitioner, I often think oh yes, researchers always say there is a need for more research, but as a practitioner, I will say I think in this case that observation is warranted. This is a woefully understudied body of work, largely because of funding constraints. And I will say that as a practitioner that has really worked hard to raise money for evaluation of our community schools work, that it has been challenging to do that. Often funders say, gee, that's a great idea and somebody should fund it, but they don't make that choice themselves. So I think that the call for more research, the specific ideas about more research that are in the report are really terrific, and I'll get to that in a moment. I'd like to move on to the next slide. As a practitioner, I wanted to respond from the point of view of practice. And as a practitioner who's comfortable with research, my fourth slide will be about evaluation issues. But on the practice issues, I think that the report did not really give enough information about the major differences in the models that were examined. For example, many of these models, in addition to seeking to integrate student supports for individual children, many of these models are also working on school transformation and whole school change. They are addressing things like school climate, student wellness, and student attendance across the board. Those are three whole school issues that I know we're engaged in our practice in New York, and community schools across the country are also engaged in that work. The second point I would make is that as a community school practitioner and someone who identifies with the community schools field very strongly, I saw a lack of clarity about the relationship of integrated student supports to the community schools field. I know that 7 of the 9 studies, or the models that were studied, are actually members of the Coalition for Community Schools. And I do see a strong relationship here. I see integrated student supports as a set of core practices that many community school practitioners are engaged in as we seek to get the right partners doing the right work with the right students. I also, and I think you were starting to get into this in the conversation about Drs. Edelman and Taylor, that I didn't see adequate attention to the ways many of these models are integrated into the life of the schools. They're integrated into governance. They're integrated with the school social workers and school guidance counselors, the school-based student supports. And I didn't see adequate attention to an issue that I think is increasingly coming to the fore in community schools work, and that is how community schools address issues of equity and social justice. I think there's increasing intentionality about that issue and increasing conversations that go beyond the achievement gap to really look at the opportunity gap facing many children in our lowest income communities. These are ideas that I offer as really friendly amendments and as a critical friend of Child Trends. Then finally, my last slide, I'd like to say a few words about evaluation issues. I think we're aware from the presentation and the report that actually what was looked at was a very narrow band of evaluations. This is a fair thing to do if you're Child Trends, so I'm not being critical here, but saying that a lot of learning may have been missed by the narrowness of or the rigor that was applied in the criteria. For example, I would have liked to have seen some things about the Healthy Start studies over many, many years that were conducted by SRI, and I think there are a number of studies coming from some of the citywide and district-wide initiatives such as Tulsa and Chicago that have quite a bit of explanatory power and might have been a useful addition. I really appreciated the call for many different kinds of evaluations moving forward. I think that comes through clearly in the report, so I appreciate that and concur with that. One of the recommendations, the recommendation about random assignment of schools, may be desirable, but may be really difficult to implement in practice. I'm not sure about that, but I worry about that. I think it's very hard to do that kind of study. I was happy to hear what Dan said about the Diplomas Plus study, which sounds like it has solved that problem. And then finally, I would say that the 3 cost studies that are cited, despite some similarities, really are counting costs very differently. For example, some of the models, and I know in our own case, the costs of school-based health centers are included in the cost analysis, whereas in models or programs that refer out, they are not. And so it's just an observation to point out that I think that that we're counting costs very differently from study to study, and we just want to be aware of that. Having said all that, I would say it's really significant that a highly regarded research team and 2 national funders took this work so seriously, and I want to express my appreciation for that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. And let's turn to some of the questions from our listeners. I'm going to start with you, Mary. We have a question asking for more discussion of the response to teachers and administrators to having ISS in their schools. You began your remarks by talking about good teachers intuitively know the values of a range of supports. But could you talk a little bit about whether there is different reactions and how you might overcome reluctance or hesitation about introducing an integrated student supports program into a school?
Well, thank you, Carol. I think that in our experience, which is all I can speak from, while principals and school staff may initially be reluctant because they're not absolutely sure how this is going to play out, within a year, they see us as full partners with them in the school. We're fully assimilated into the school, and for the most part, teachers sometimes don't know if we're district staff in some cases. We do a lot every year. We evaluate anonymously the teachers and the community agency partners and also the principals. And within a year, the satisfaction rate from teachers and principals has been averaging 90% with high satisfaction. What they really appreciate for teachers is the opportunity to share the burden of the challenge of seeing children with significant needs and significant strengths not having the opportunities to have those addressed and supported. And so when there's somebody in the building with them, in the case of elementary schools, which sometimes have no student support staff, or when the student support staff, as they often are overwhelmed with dealing with kids with intensive needs, they really value the fact that they can look at every child and no child goes through the cracks, so to speak, and they have a partner. Teachers tell us, and what has impacted me most significantly is teachers spontaneously reporting that reviewing the strengths and needs of every child in their classroom helps them to develop an empathy with students that allows them to act differently. In the case of the student, for example, who might be a behavior problem or have learning challenges, they come to understand why, which is so critical in being able to effectively provide instruction to that child.
Thank you, Mary. I'm going to widen the lens a little bit now, or widen it quite a bit, from the individual school experience to the national education reform question. So Dan, for you, what's your view about where ISS fits in the sort of panoply of education reform initiatives and in the whole education reform movement?
Thanks for the question. There are a couple of things. Kind of broadly, I think we're at a moment right now when the last 8 to 10 years of education reform regarding kind of a hyper-focus on teacher quality and data systems and kind of management issues have kind of birthed a moment when the leaders of many of those kind of reform frameworks are now turning and wondering how do they reconcile what is becoming an irrefutable amount of evidence regarding the implications of poverty. And so there's been this false dichotomy in the education reform conversations over the last 10 years that it's either poverty needs to be remedied before schools can, or schools need to be fixed before poverty can. And I think it's both are important, and I think integrated student services have become a bridge in that conversation and closing that false gap. So I think there's just a kind of meta frame that's worth holding. Specifically, what our observations and certainly our work at communities and schools has been to focus at both the federal and the state level. Folks on the phone know, I'm sure better than I do, that the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act has been slowed down. That being said, both sides of the aisle, we have found that there is a hunger to understand how to use a student support strategy in the architecture of these school reform initiatives. So most recently we've seen in the Senate bill for the ESCA reauthorization really a lifting up of the integrated student support strategy into the overall design of supporting low-performing schools. So this notion that we talked about in terms of systemic impact and really trying to privilege a notion of equity and social justice, there's, I think, been a real sympathy to the student support strategy as a mechanism to achieve that. And certainly at the state level, observations are that there is a real hunger for strategies that are based in evidence and that can be accommodated to whatever the framework is that's going on at the state or local level. So in the end, I think if we talk about this work, we want to make sure that we don't become overly prescriptive around all the things it's supposed to do. And because I think superintendents at the local level and at the state level are hired to lead the education reform work in their whatever their purview is, a state or local purview. And they are looking for mechanisms to align with their overall school improvement strategy that will accelerate the impact. I think the student support strategy has increasingly, in our observation, been seen as a flexible but evidence-based strategy that allows for local education leaders to really lean into their expertise and bring in a kind of expertise that allows them to have the student supports attended to but aligned with what they're trying to get accomplished.
Well, that's a nice segue to my next question, which is for Jane. Jane, it seems like all of the nation's eyes are on New York with your new mayor. And I wonder if you could give us a few insights into the likelihood that this sort of approach to supporting low-income students is likely to get some additional play in New York.
Well, I think it already is, and I think you're right that the eyes of the nation are on us, and I think for good reason. I think Mayor de Blasio, he moved from fourth place to first place as a mayoral candidate, really on a very bold platform about the expansion of pre-K, making pre-K universal in New York City, full-day pre-K, and really talking about this as an investment, and then also talked about wanting to make after-school programs, one of the critical supports, universally available to every middle school student who wanted to participate. He also, as part of his education platform, said that he plans to increase by 100 the number of community schools in New York City. So I think that the agenda we're talking about today is very much on his mind as he begins to run the city. And he, although the public disagreement between him and our governor about how to pay for pre-K has gotten a lot of visibility, what has not gotten a lot of visibility is that our governor, Governor Cuomo, his Education Reform Commission certainly backed community schools as one of its primary reform strategies. And so I think that the work in New York City that is proposed is going to be operating in a state context where the policy framework is very positive and where actually the funding framework is very positive. So keep your eyes on us and hold our feet to the fire. We think these are excellent goals that have a good chance of being accomplished within the next 4 years.
Thank you. We have another question in on the long-term impacts of ISS. Specifically, is there research related to the long-term impacts of ISS, and have any of the different approaches researched this aspect? Chris, do you want to respond first to that in terms of long-term studies?
Sure, because I think I can be pretty quick. We were not able to find any long-term evaluation studies. Certainly there's lots of research, though, that shows that students who finish high school and who further their education after high school do much better in practically every domain of life. So it's a reasonable hypothesis that if you can get them that far, they're going to go further in the long run.
Anyone else care to
yeah, just want to, this is Dan, just two things we've observed, and I love Jane's frame around being a practitioner. So from a practitioner's point of view, we have a whole performance management system across our whole network, and we are observing that there is a fairly high pickup rate from our seniors to matriculate into post-secondary. Now what happens afterwards is has been unclear, and increasingly, and this is really much more anecdotally, we're seeing a number of our local affiliates who are just amazing social entrepreneurs and innovators beginning to partner particularly with community colleges and really evolving the integrated student support strategy, which has historically for us been in the K through 12 space, really now into the post-secondary and particularly around the community college to create a kind of a continuum. It does get accommodated because the needs do begin to change as you get working adults. But so that's, we do know there's a high drop-off rate, of course, with poor kids. It's post-secondary attainment is an extremely big challenge. So I think there's a body of work for us both to innovate and evaluate here.
And this is Mary. Clearly, we've seen in our longitudinal studies, we have data from children starting in 2001, and they're now at the high school graduation level. We've seen half the dropout rate for kids that had it, even in the first 5 grades, which is pretty stunning, I think, that it has that kind of an impact, and that argues pretty compellingly for doing the work. We're just beginning in Ohio to look at matriculation into community college, as Dan was talking about, and further we're going to be tracking students from the community college into 4-year colleges. I think this is very important, a very important area, the very long-term impact.
I would just add, this is Jane, I would just add that I'm aware of one really compelling study that was done by researchers at UCLA of a wonderful after-school program for elementary school students in Los Angeles. I mean, a big program, many elementary schools, I think over 100 are involved in it. And what these researchers found was that the children who had participated in this high-quality after-school program in elementary schools actually had higher graduation rates. The hypothesis being that they had learned good work habits and good study skills and good social and emotional skills in elementary school that served them well through the whole K-12 enterprise. So I think that's a piece of research that's important to take a look at. But I think we have an example here really of a situation where the practice is a bit ahead of the evaluation. I think there are a number of efforts going on around high school graduation, college readiness, and success in college that are happening on the practice level that have not yet been evaluated.
Thank you. We have a question specifically about the lack of findings on non-academic factors. in the ISS evaluations that we looked at. And the questioner says there may be a need for a closer look at the family-community connection with the school and with ISS professionals. Is this possible? How can it be addressed? Do the parents and community partners feel that they have a true role in the ISS process? I'm going to ask each of the three practitioners to respond briefly on in turn. Jane, why don't you start us out?
Okay, well, I will say that I think there are some studies of some of the programmatic components that you see in, I will speak from the perspective of community schools, which is what I know best. For the last 20 years or so, we've had some good data on, from a researcher named Deborah Vandell, on the effects of children's participation in high-quality after-school programs. And what has shown up there is not only academic gains, but better social and emotional adjustment. And so I think if we look at some of the other research that relates to what goes on in a lot of the schools that we're talking about, we might see both some non-academic results as well as some ways of looking at non-academic results. To the question about whether parents and communities feel engaged, I think there's a lot of variation. I know plenty of community schools where parents are very engaged and feel very engaged, and where there's been a documentation of huge increases in parental engagement both in school and in the life of their, in their children's educational lives. So I think we do have data about that, but I wouldn't say that it is universal. I think that it depends very much on the behavior of the schools as well as the behavior of the community partners, whether schools are welcoming places and whether they really have a sort of a ladder of opportunities, a variety of ways for parents to be engaged in the school and to become more engaged in their children's educational lives.
Okay, and Mary and Dan, briefly, do you want to jump in on that point?
Sure.
On that question.
Our data on thriving shows that students at the elementary level, particularly English language learners, the effects are stronger for them. But all students experience an increase in effort, motivation, and also work habits. Back to what Jane was talking about, the after-school study. And with regard to community partners, we have multiple years of data on the involvement of community partners. We ask them to compare working with a City Connect school versus a non-City Connect school, and this was an anonymous survey. And clearly, they rate their engagement with City Connect schools as much more effective for them as hardworking community partners. They find it very easy to have somebody in the school that they can connect with and that makes appropriate referrals to the agency.
And Dan?
Just two brief things. I agree with a fair amount of what both Mary and Jane have said. The thing that I think I can add is that just an observation as a practitioner, again, that communities and schools in the last 10 years really went from about engaging 25,000, 30,000 parents or guardians to really 250 this year, 1,000. So what we've looked at that and really investigated with our affiliates as to why. And what we're hearing is that there is, particularly among the super disenfranchised and English language learning community, there is a real fear around parental engagement and outreach. And so what we have found, almost half of our staff are bilingual in the schools. So their ability to move out into communities, do family visits, and create a bridge that allows for building a competency around how to engage and really that there's a leadership role for parents in the school life. So we're seeing this. And then to the non-academic outcomes, we're rolling out a brand new data management system. Delighted with it so far. And we have added a whole suite of indicators around non-academic competencies. Because we realize from the research this is a terribly under-researched area. So we're hoping from the first stage of developing performance management for ourselves that will generate research questions we can take a deeper dive on.
Thank you. Chris Moore, I want to ask you if you have any final comments or observations that you'd like to offer before we wrap up.
Well, thanks to everyone who participated, and I think it's wonderful that the research and the evaluation and the practitioner communities can communicate so well, because that's what it's going to take to improve educational outcomes. Thanks so much.
And I will just add my thanks to Dan Cardinale and Mary Walsh and Jane Quinn, and of course to you, Chris Moore, for your time today and your really thoughtful and insightful comments. It was an exciting study for us to do. It's you know, we knew from the beginning that that there were some important questions to be examined here, and we hope to continue to do work in this field in the future. So thank you all. For those of you who have who dialed in or called in to this webinar, thanks for your attention and your interest. The slides will be available on Child Trend's website tomorrow, and we look forward to meeting you on another webinar in the not too distant future. So thank you to everyone.